Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to get started in just a moment. We're going to wait a few more minutes, just 1 or 2 minutes for folks to join us. But thank you so much if you can hear us for joining us today. We're excited to have you here, and we'll get started momentarily. All right, hello again, everyone. My name is Michelle Higgins. I'm the Manager of Strategic Engagement at SMU DataArts. And on behalf of our whole team, we really appreciate you joining this afternoon's research presentation of our most recently published work, The Intersection of Funding, Marketing, and Audience Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which is authored by Zannie Voss, Glenn Voss, and Young Park. This new research is part of a series of recent publications that are designed to help arts and cultural organizations contend with the crisis of systemic racism and answer the question of when we reopen, whom will we gather? Before I introduce Zannie, I want to acknowledge that we are still in the middle of some challenging circumstances as individuals and for many of us in our roles at arts and cultural organizations. So we are so glad to be able to connect with so many of you remotely in this moment today and grateful for your time. So just a few housekeeping items. We have a number of guests joining. We're going to keep everyone on mute so we can preserve our sound quality. We're going to be using the Q&A and the chat features today. So hopefully you're familiar with this by now, but at the bottom of your screen, you should see the Q&A feature. So any questions that you have for Zannie, we'll address those at the end, but please feel free throughout the presentation to put those in the Q&A. There's also the chat feature. If you have any technology issues, you're welcome to chat with one of our support staff here and reach out through the chat. And we're also going to be posing questions to you that we would love for you to answer in the chat as well. One last note is that we are recording this presentation and we'll be sharing that recorded presentation as well as PDF slides in the follow-up communications. I apologize, I missed my note about closed captioning. So we do have closed captioning today. You can click the CC icon to turn that on, and then you will be prompted to view closed captions via subtitles or by live transcript, either one. You will also see a subtitles settings tab to make adjustments as you need to. And if you need assistance with this, please do send us a chat. So with that, I am so pleased to introduce Dr. Zannie Voss. Dr. Voss is the director of SMU DataArts, of course, the National Center for Arts Research and professor of arts management in SMU's Meadows School of the Arts and the Cox School of Business. She served as chair of arts management and arts entrepreneurship at SMU for 10 years. Prior to joining the SMU faculty, she was a professor at Duke University and producing director of theater previews at Duke, where she developed and co-produced more than a dozen new plays, musicals, 2 of which ran on Broadway with a national tour. Zannie has published articles examining the strategic factors that influence organizational performance in leading academic journals in marketing and management. She currently serves on the boards of the International Association of Arts and Cultural Management, TRG Arts, the Dallas Symphony, the New Orleans Museum of Art, and TACA, and she is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Arts. So Zannie, we are excited to learn more with you today.
Michelle, thank you so much. Thanks also to Monica and Rochelle, and welcome and thanks to all of you for taking time out to learn about this project. I'd actually like to start by getting you involved. I want to hear from you. On the count of 3, if you would use the chat, share with me your answer to the questions. Do you think that it's within your power to influence audience diversity? And if so, how? 1, 2, 3. Love to get your feedback here. Is this something that just happens, or is audience diversity something that we're actually able to influence? This research explores historical inequities that are attracting increased scrutiny within the art sector and in broader society. Think about it, grant makers in the arts, all the national service organizations, each of the organizations in these performing arts sectors are committed to advancing audience diversity, equity, inclusion. The question is, are they succeeding? So we get going on this research, just given the current moment, thinking about, we live in a time of polarization and injustice and racial and economic polarization. We think about the fact that as inequality and population diversity are on the increase, intergroup conflict arises over who attains access and who retains power. Perceived threats to access and dominance engender rhetoric that demonizes the other, whoever that other may be. It leads to reduced quality of life for marginalized communities, and it erodes social cohesion and democracy. So the question is, to what extent are we, the field of arts and culture, complicit in exacerbating the problems of polarization, despite espoused values of equity, diversity, and inclusion? And what's the extent to which real change in achieving DEI will play a key role in maintaining the legitimacy of our field moving forward? So the research is focused on 3 questions. The first is, to what extent do audiences of nonprofit performing arts organizations in traditionally Eurocentric arts sectors, and you see here the art sectors that we're examining, to what extent do they represent the racial and income diversity of the communities they serve? And has audience DEI improved over time? Second, does support from different funder groups have an impact on organizations' level of audience DEI? And is there evidence that funder priorities have also shifted over time? So in other words, what kinds of funders impact DEI? What does it mean for organizations that have to delicately balance tensions between stakeholders? And third, how does an organization's characteristics, like its location or its subscriber base and its marketing actions, impact audience DEI? So do organizations make decisions, either intentionally or unintentionally, that make them unwelcoming places for diverse audiences? And the questions of, how do you influence audience behavior so that people will seek out experiences where they can encounter people who don't look like them, who don't share the same characteristics? So in sum, can and do arts and cultural organizations and the funders that support them contribute to social integration and harmony in a very diverse marketplace? I'm going to start us off with some of the key concepts we look at. So we talk a lot about DEI within the field of arts and culture. So let's unpack it, unpacking diversity, equity, and inclusion, because they're different concepts. So diversity is just the degree of variation along any dimension. So it's really looking at taking it a step further, saying diversity, but relative to what? So is it equitable? Is there fair and equal access to participation opportunities? And then thinking about inclusion as the extent to which participation rates reflect equity. And I want to really hit on this idea of inclusion, because there's been a lot written about it recently. There was one study that shows that diversity actually doesn't have the positive impact that you'd expect unless there's also inclusion. So this notion of a desire to belong, it's perhaps the greatest driver of behavioral choice. And the subtle fear of exclusion due to a failure of not fitting in to a dominant culture, or for saying or doing the wrong thing, inhibits participation. And a sense of belonging really has to be fostered to create genuine inclusiveness. In the words of a Broadway producer quoted in Forbes this month, we just don't consistently invite BIPOC community members, not in the press, not in our marketing. We have not historically done that audience development work. And so I want to go on then and talk about how we take these concepts and kind of wrap them up into audience DEI. The extent to which the diversity of the served audience represents equitable participation. How much does it reflect equitable participation? And we look along 2 different dimensions that came up in a lot of our qualitative work around this research. The first is racial representativeness. So what's the extent to which the racial characteristics of the served customer base reflect equitable participation? And income representativeness, similar idea, but the extent to which income characteristics of the served customer base reflect equitable participation. And there, I'd love to hear your thoughts and your input on this as well. Use the chat function. Does your organization actually have specific goals for audience diversity and or racial or income representativeness? Or is it just an ethos that everyone believes in, but they're not specific measurable goals for whether the organization's making progress? And if you do have specific goals, can you just share with the group what they are in the chat function? So some additional key concepts. We believe that a better world is one in which shared cultural experiences attenuate negative perceptions of others, unite spatially and socially divided citizens, and facilitate access to better quality of life for everyone in the community. This is based on UNESCO. We all want to create a better world. So it's not just saying there are diverse audiences, but they're kept separate, but how do you bring people together in a shared space who are different to begin appreciating different perspectives and different cultures? We want a better world, but human nature gets in the way. So I want to talk about some of the key concepts related to DEI. It's particularly important in service environments and environments where people gather. And there's an underlying human nature factor called homophily. And so according to this principle of homophily, people prefer experiences with others whom they perceive to be similar. We just naturally gravitate to people who share our characteristics. For businesses, for organizations, this kind of a preference can actually lead to a stronger brand identification, more social identity with the service provider for organizations that encourage this sense of gathering with others who look alike. At the same time, though, it also creates a strategic dilemma. Should arts and cultural organizations create a homophilious experience for audiences with the same traits, having more organizations who are whiter and wealthier and attracted to come to be with others who are like them, or promote DEI for the broader community? The arts leaders with whom we spoke in this research identified the early 2010s as a turning point in audience DEI. Kind of coming out of the recession, struggling to rebuild audiences, arts leaders began paying more attention to shifting demographic patterns and their ability to develop new audiences. In this state, we looked, in talking with arts leaders, there were 33 arts professionals with whom we spoke, and we had a lot of data. We studied 18 million transactions for 1.9 million households that patronized 24 large performing arts organizations. And we looked at a long arc of time from 2011 to 2017 to see how did things change with respect to coming out of recession and rebuilding. Some of what we heard from arts leaders: my city is majority minority. We weren't growing, and yet there were about 450,000 African Americans in our community whom we weren't serving. From a purely business standpoint, there's all those customers we weren't talking to. We saw DEI as a way of bringing in new audience segments. And then there's always the balance between that and the civil rights lens, the moral imperative lens. As audiences for these large performing arts organizations started to decline, DEI, as you can see in this quote, was really viewed as a way for organizations to develop new audiences. And then the funder community got behind the organizations and the initiative to help them incentivize and support their efforts. And these perceptions of growth, these were actually coinciding with trends in broader society at the same time. If you look at Google search trends, they indicated that wider societal change may have shifted both organizational and donor priorities over the duration of the study. Interest in income inequality increased nearly 300% in Google searches between 2010 and 2014. And interest in racial inequality more than doubled between 2010 and 2016. So let's take a look at some of the answers to the questions that we posed. So what's the current state of audience DEI at these performing arts organizations? If we look at racial representativeness, it's saying really relative to the percentage of the population that holds these characteristics, what percentage of the customer base hold these characteristics? And what we see is that racial representativeness was only 17% of customers, but 44% of the population of the communities in which these organizations operated. So if you divide those two, we see that the representativeness was about 39 or 39%. In terms of income representativeness, we see that it was even more stark. If you look at households with income under 50,000, there were 14% of customers and 42% of the population. So income representativeness was only 33%. So the organizations are underrepresenting the income and the racial diversity of the communities in which they reside. So BIPOC and lower income segments were significantly underrepresented by more than half. And according to the IRS, you think about it, nonprofit organizations provide service or facilities. We get this nonprofit status because we exist to serve the general public on a continuing basis. And you could say for these organizations, well, you're saying that they underrepresented their local communities, but was it even a priority for them? We looked, and those included in this study, 75% of them explicitly publicized audience DEI statements on their website, and the remaining 25% describe on their websites programs that seek to serve targeted demographic or socioeconomic segments of their communities. So it was a priority. Now you may be saying, well, hey, these figures seem really low given the organizational efforts and all the funder attention devoted to DEI initiatives in recent years. But it's important to keep in mind that the data examined in this study relates to audience attendance, both paid and free, because the underlying premise of the study is that bringing people together, getting diverse audiences together for cultural events is a step towards reducing the sense of polarization. The data doesn't capture participation in education or outreach program that would fall outside of ticketed box office activity. What we heard was that numerous classical music organizations, for example, share that their successful DEI work is actually done through their educational programming. And they attempt to cross over those served through education programmings and their families into the core concert production series, but they've met with limited success in doing so, to their frustration. We heard quotes like this when we've had predominantly white audiences and predominantly African Americans participating in our education programs. We're working on things that will bring those audiences together, but so far they've not succeeded. They are successful, but in separate environments, not in a shared environment. So let's look at, over time, did it improve? Here you can see that average racial representative trends, we looked here across different arts and cultural sectors saying, if it's improved or decreased over time, is it similarly throughout these different segments? And for all of the different sectors, racial representativeness improved over time, whereas income representativeness actually decreased for organizations across all sectors. So the emphasis clearly in the field has been on increasing racial representativeness, much less so on bringing in people who are lower income. And notice that for both racial and income representativeness, in no year did an organization's audiences mirror even 50% of the racial and income diversity of their communities. So how does funder support vary over time for different funder groups? And how does it impact an organization's level of audience DEI? Is there evidence that funder priorities have shifted? Here's a quote, our individual donor base in the major gift category rarely engages in this DEI conversation with us. It isn't like in the social services where the donor gives because they just care about the good of the community. For theater fundraising, the argument is give us money because you're going to be the user of our product and you'll engage and be enlightened. So with respect to individual contributions, what we found was that individual donor support, because of this variety, it had no impact on racial representativeness of the audience, but it did have a modest, increasingly positive impact on the level of income representativeness. So the more an organization was raising funds from individuals, slightly more income representativeness in their data. It points to kind of an evolution in individual motivations that coincides with growing societal awareness about income inequality in particular. For foundations, this is a quote actually from a funder. Diversity was articulated in our 2014 mission statement and our foundation's first strategic plan that year, and it has been refined since to embrace equity and inclusion and now social justice. We see a big impact with respect to foundation funding. We see that foundation funding had a positive impact not only on racial representatives, but also income representativeness, and it intensified over time. So the way to look at these two charts, you can see back in 2011, for example, whether an organization had a high level or a low level of foundation support, it really didn't impact its racial representativeness. With time, if it had received a foundation grant in 2011, and you look at 2013, 2015, there was an increasing positive bump in racial representativeness for organizations that were receiving higher foundation funding. Same goes for the trend with respect to increasing impact on income representativeness for organizations that received higher levels of foundation funding. So a lot of positive impact in those kinds of initiatives that were intended to increase audience DEI. For corporations, we found that actually corporate giving had a counter effect. Early on in the period, actually high corporate support had a pretty big impact in terms of both racial and income representativeness. It's decreased over time. It's actually the only place in our study where having high corporate support actually led to significantly lower levels of income diversity. Low levels of support led to higher income and higher racial diversity. So it's a really interesting dynamic. Over time, you think about it, corporate philanthropy itself has become less altruistic in nature. It's more oriented towards strategic philanthropy, and that's looking to enhance both business and social value. This high racial representativeness with steady corporate support, perhaps it doesn't look at a level of racial diversity. It's simply looking at, does the audience member have purchasing power? That's what's important. As one arts leader said, corporate giving is tied to brand exposure. Corporations want to reach an audience that's got a lot of disposable income. It could be that this kind of counterintuitive findings that it's actually a disincentivization when you receive high levels of corporate funding. It could be that organizations with low corporate support are actually kind of unshackled from the pressure to focus on reaching a certain racial and/or income demographic desired by corporations. The positive trends for organizations with low levels of corporate support are intriguing, and they really underscore some of these tensions in stakeholder support and audience DEI objectives. And lastly, we have government. Government funding is a huge partner in driving DEI. One of the unique things we've done is tap into city agencies beyond the cultural affairs groups that are now interested in seeing greater access for diverse audiences. Government funding has had an increasingly positive impact on both racial and income representativeness. The charts for government look very, very similar to those of foundation funding. Both foundation and government funding increasingly positive impact for organizations with higher levels. So in sum, we see kind of collectively that these results support the idea that achieving the objective of equal access to underserved segments of the population, it really does require this sustained support and effort over time. So let's take a look at some other phenomena that are more fixed. So how does an organization's location and its subscriber base impact audience DEI? Now you think about it, shared cultural experiences occur in context, not in a vacuum. So we investigated the impact of these two key contextual factors. This context of place, you think about it, it's one of the 4 P's of marketing, place. We explored the extent to which an organization's location and the characteristics of its surrounding community impact an audience's willingness to become part of the shared experience that it offers. So the characteristics of location can either act as a welcoming portal or as a barrier for historically underserved segments. And here's what we learned. Where you're located really matters. The diversity of the organization's immediate neighborhood had a positive effect on both kinds of DEI. So organizations that are located in more racially and or income diverse neighborhoods have an audience base that's more reflective of that diversity. Distance is actually a more important barrier for BIPOC and lower income households. If their household is located further from the organization, they're even less willing than a non-BIPOC or a higher income household to attend. I mean, it's an obvious barrier with respect to location. Access is curtailed for people who live further from the location. So this is not only representing a physical barrier, this idea of distance, but it's also a psychological barrier. We're seeing in this third point that when people travel within a city, they tend to select destinations where the sociodemographic characteristics of that destination are similar to their own. so customers feel more comfortable attending performing arts venues in neighborhoods that reflect their racial and socioeconomic characteristics, underscoring this existence of the notion of homophily. And one of the quotes an arts leader shared was, when the theater is surrounded by white communities, getting a diverse audience to see diverse work can be more difficult than providing the work itself. A second factor that we looked at was the context of the makeup of the fellow audience members with whom the experience is going to be shared. So we think of a large subscriber base typically as something desirable. Subscribers, they represent a base of loyal audience members who provide security of upfront cash that are going to fill seats throughout the year. That's all great. They require less in terms of marketing expenditure to attract and to retain than single ticket buyers. However, our findings reveal this dark side to having a large subscriber base. The more these performing arts organizations fill seats with subscribers, the lower their levels of audience, racial, and income representativeness. Homophily comes into play, which can create a psychological barrier for historically underserved segments. Subscribers can form an in-group to which non-subscribers don't belong. And if this subscriber in-group is predominantly white and affluent, then the BIPOC and lower income people who are more likely to self-identify as belonging to a minority outgroup in the space. This quote, really, I couldn't say it better, that it's important to understand as a predominantly white organization how it feels to engage as a person of color. Our subscriber base is still an older, whiter base. And you have to think about what visual cues communicate about inclusion. We heard comments like this from 5 of the participants. We did a play by an African-American playwright, and the theater was half moon-shaped with 6 seating sections. Sure enough, the subscribers were in the central seats. There were 4 center sections of white people flanked by 2 sections of African-American people. It was horrifying. We had to release all the house seats immediately so that we could increase inventory and change the dynamics of that situation. This idea of in-group, out-group, sometimes we're not even aware of the kinds of environments and the sense of welcoming and real inclusion that we create within our houses. So how does an organization's marketing actions impact audience DEI? So one of the findings was simply that higher investments in advertising have a positive impact on racial and income DEI. In the end, we know that it's not only the size of the investment, but also the quality of the advertising that matters. And as we heard in interviews, DEI success depends on advertising to diverse audiences in a voice that's authentic and targeted. Organizations that want to close the audience representative gap have to spend more on marketing communications, but wisely. And price, we found that it had a negative effect on both types of diversity. Not too surprising. Naturally, it was a stronger negative effect on income diversity. But price, we looked at prices like what is the average price paid by audience members in targeted census tracts. So within the census tract, what was the price paid? So keying it onto what are the person's the audience characteristics. We did some modeling here, and our analyses indicate that a 10% targeted price discount can actually increase income representativeness by nearly 3 points. Third, offering more differentiated packages and promotions for core programming has positive effects on both diversity types. Here adding multiple differentiated packages, whether it's like a young night professional series with a pre-show mixer, or a Sunday matinee family series, or pay what you want, or rush tickets, these are all different ways that we think about packaging. These increase the diversity of the marketing program in meaningful ways with positive impact on both kinds of representativeness. But this comment really is a word about careful management of market segmentation, how it's managed to bring people together. Arts leaders provided numerous examples of big productions that target a specific racial or income specific segment, or culturally specific festivals designed to increase representativeness. But paradoxically, these efforts to increase audience DEI actually may exacerbate polarization by providing separate rather than integrated consumption experiences to diverse segments, who they in and of themselves have their own homophilious tendencies. So as one arts leader observed, there is a danger in the practice of segmented marketing and packages also coming off as segregation. Biases can lead mainstream organizations who are predominantly white to overestimate their level of success with respect to racial diversity, while racially diverse audience members perceive a different reality. So thinking about as you're bringing people together, are you really creating an inclusive environment? And here are some thoughts that we wanted to share along those lines about how can large performing arts organizations use this information to make informed decisions that advance audience DEI. I think first and foremost, simply engaging in honest discussions about whether your organization perpetuates homophilious tendencies, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Second, set diversity goals and measure progress. Organizations can start by getting a benchmark of audience demographics once performances resume in person. Then goals can be set for the level of audience representativeness the organization wants to achieve within a specific time frame. Do you know your community's demographic and economic characteristics? How are you going to create a roadmap and monitor progress as to whether you're getting there? Although our sample organizations had websites featuring DEI statements and descriptions of programs that target specific communities, none of the organizations with whom we spoke had EDI goals, specific representativeness goals. Not a single organization had specific articulated roadmap for where it was or where it wanted to be. So to quote Yogi Berra, if you don't know where you're going, you might wind up someplace else. It requires understanding where are you and where do you want to go. Third, this is going to seem perhaps heretical, but consider limiting the size of your subscriber base if it's largely white and wealthier, and consider the visual message that you send based on subscriber seating. For these performing arts organizations, building a large, loyal subscriber base winds up undermining DEI initiatives. We recognize that this is going to be a difficult concept to think about, but look at even particularly as organizations have been closed, as you're reopening and seating perhaps has to be socially distanced anyway, in reseating, can you think about how to redistribute seating for subscribers so that there's opportunities for new and diverse single ticket buyers to be able to be interspersed in the best seats along with the longtime subscribers? When asked about an organization's commitment to increasing audience DEI, a marketing director with whom we spoke acknowledged, always, always, but with limited resources, you have to put your money where you're going to earn the most revenue. Another arts leader commented that our concern coming out of this crisis will be that we need to focus on revenue-driven projects. Since we're all facing so much financial pressures right now, we're really concerned that important DEI missions are going to be put on hold, put on the back burner as organizations are reopening. And we argue that arts and cultural organizations actually have an opportunity now to take a leadership role in communities by keeping DEI within their sphere of focus in creating revenue-driven projects. Use available marketing levers, increase the number of differentiated packages that you offer for core programming. Think about how to bring people together, but in the communications, tailor the target marketing preferences based on price, based on promotion, based on messaging. Increase the investment in advertising if the goal is greater racial diversity and income diversity. Create very, very targeted lower price points. Pricing plays a role in achieving EDI, but it's not the total solution. Think about who you approach for funding. Seek foundation and government support for all DEI initiatives, individual support for income diversity initiatives. Corporate support increasingly appears to work against DEI. Again, unshackled from corporate support, organizations are able to think about welcoming more income diverse as well as racially diverse audiences. And lastly, engage those who live nearby if your organization is located in a diverse neighborhood. Being community focused, paying close attention to people living nearby who are now accustomed to staying closer to home as different commuting patterns have shifted during the pandemic. Take advantage of this. The fact that there's a much higher likelihood of purchase among household in an arts organization's immediate neighborhood, particularly by lower income and BIPOC members of the community, means that those living nearby should take on added importance. Now, we recognize that additional factors likely play a role in driving audience DEI. For instance, we did not directly examine artistic decisions related to the core content of the programs offered, content that really likely has a very strong impact on performing arts organization success in attracting diverse audience members. One might hypothesize that all this is great, but it's really about programming, where we found that these different factors actually have a significant impact as well. Research by Jen Benoit Bryan and colleagues at Slover Lynette, their research suggests that while BIPOC Americans expressed a desire for programming that was more reflective, it had more reflective and dynamic content, they overwhelmingly prioritized a desire for arts and cultural organizations to change after the pandemic by becoming more inclusive and community-centered and more casual and enjoyable. So for funders, so thinking about this question again, when your doors reopen, whom will you gather? So how can funders and audiences use this information to make informed decisions? For funders, question and examine whether your philanthropic support has resulted in the desired impact. And if there are opportunities to enhance audience DEI by equitably funding arts and cultural organizations that primarily serve BIPOC or lower income communities, alongside continued investment in the performing arts organizations with concrete commitments to measurably improve and welcome diverse audiences. And for audiences, we all have our own tendencies. And what we encourage is be mindful of the groups in which you gather. Seek out shared cultural experiences that are more inclusive and community-centered and help make them so. It's those among us who are dedicated to performing arts organizations, similar to those in the study, and who also value social justice and equity, reflect on the extent to which you may unwittingly play a role in exacerbating polarization. How many times do you walk into a house for a performing arts event that's completely filled with, or just about completely filled with, white individuals who are all well-dressed, and think about whether or not that's a problem? It's a question of, do audience members themselves want to be diversified? Do they care about diversity? Or are they unaware of the pervasive nature of the sameness of individuals who are around them? Findings from this study can encourage everyone who loves the performing arts to ask themselves how they help or how they hinder creation of shared cultural experiences that are more inclusive and community-centered. So a few final thoughts on future directions. Future questions that we had coming out of this research. Would a visible increase in workforce diversity of the organization positively impact the diversity of the audience base? And workforce being the artists as well as the ushers, the administrators, the board. Which customers are attracted to or put off by perhaps heterophilous consumption experiences? So the opposite of seeking out experiences among people who don't share their traits. And can customers be conditioned to seek out consumption experiences with people unlike themselves through regular exposures to others in a thought-provoking and shared environment? And lastly, and quite importantly, how would these results change for culturally specific organizations? These are all questions that we're interested in looking at into the future. And with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. You have my contact information here, and I'm always happy to get contact and feedback, myself through my email. But we're going to open it up for questions. And one thing that I would like to pose to you, in reflecting on what you've heard today, what's one takeaway from this research that you'd like to explore further at your own organization? What was one thing that you heard that you said, this is something that we should probably go back and talk about? And Michelle, with that, I'm going to stop my share and welcome comments and welcome questions.
Thank you, Zannie. As folks chat in, I will happily read those out loud. There was a question that I'll start us off with a question, and it's related to a question we had in the chat about some of your modeling, Zannie. So we all know and love you as a arts researcher. Could you talk, and this is a question I had for you after hearing this, this research earlier. So can you talk a little bit about the regression analysis that you used and how you showed that the traits are that the income and racial representativeness are in fact impacting that audience diversity, or that those diversity metrics?
So two things to point out. A regression analysis is putting in factors to help explain an outcome. Really, that's what regression analysis is about. It's about what impacts an outcome and to what extent does it have explanatory power in explaining the outcome? So you think about it, when we put into these equations, if we're looking at, let's say, racial representativeness as an outcome, we're looking in, let's say, year one. We look in year -1 for how much funding did the organization get from foundations, corporations, individuals in year T-1 to impact the next year's activity, just kind of with the natural expectation as you get funded and then you act. In the process, we also put in the marketing actions. We also put in this notion of time. Did the year matter? Did it change over time? You try to put everything into the mix and then look at what's the extent to which each of these variables, when considered together, do they have an impact on the outcome? There are times where you put things into the regression equation and they are non-significant, and so we don't report on them. We only report on factors that do have some degree of explanatory power of what the outcome measure actually happens to be. And I'd be more than happy to share with you the models of how did we come up with the linking of the box office data with Census Bureau data for these census tracts. That was a really interesting process as well. And it's something that we intend to continue to implement. This is a project we've worked on for about 2 years now. It took a really long time to figure out how to get these estimates at a small enough geographic area where you're really able to ascertain what are the characteristics of the households that you're looking at. So I hope that provided some illumination. I'm more than happy to get into regression analysis in more depth if that's what you guys desire.
Thank you, Zannie.
Sure.
So yes, we're going to open it up for questions. If you have any questions at all, you can use the Q&A feature or the chat. We see both for Zannie. And as we're waiting for questions to come in, I do want to just mention a couple of things. So our plan right now is to motivate this research through some interactive webinars later this summer. So if you have kind of more to share and reflect on this topic after today's presentation, I just wanted to plant a little seed to look out for some announcements for those events that will come a little later this summer. And with that note, I'm going to check and make sure we have any. I think you've just wowed people, Zannie. People are just wowed and amazed. I find this research really, really fascinating. It's also a lot to take in and kind of reckon with. So here's a question. Are there plans to do a deeper dive study that does consider programming impacts on racial and income diversity?
So I want to just kind of throw that out for this group to get input on. You think about it's such a qualitative thing to be able to analyze the diversity of the programs. So I'm curious to hear input. If we talked about, well, how diverse was the programming of the organization? So would you look at diversity of programming? Let's say it's a classical music group. Would you do that through looking at, was there diversity within the orchestra members? Was it a diverse composer? Like, what aspects of programming have to be diverse in order for it to be considered diverse? If it's a theater company, let's say if it's an all Latino cast doing a work by a European or by an Anglo writer, is that considered diverse? There's all the qualitative parts of it. So I say that only it's really difficult to collect data from organizations where they're telling you and reporting on what was the diversity of the programming, what kind of programming, not just how many programs, but what kind of programming. If I had that magic bullet data point, I would love to include it in the model. And who knows, maybe if we put that in, some of the other elements that we have found significance on maybe would diminish in their strength of explaining. It was really heartening to learn about the findings from the Slover-Lynette study, simply because we all like to say, oh, it's just about programming, where when they interviewed thousands and thousands of people out in the communities, part of what they heard was, we're people of color, and what we want is to be welcomed. We want to be included. Yeah, the content is important, but that's not the only thing that will draw us. It's what kind of environment are you creating? I spoke with someone yesterday, a funder, who brought up a fantastic question that I'd never really thought about before. He said, mega churches have gotten this right. You start in a service and they say, okay, now turn to the person to your left and your right or front of you, behind you, and introduce yourself and let them know something about you. What does that do for establishing a sense of community and making people feel like you're there, I see you, I recognize you. We have now started some kind of social bond, as opposed to anonymously walking into a performing arts organization where all of the seats are taken by people who are whiter and wealthier. And as another interviewee said, all the Black and brown people around the perimeter edges, what are you saying about whether we value including you in this work? So how do you start having internal conversations about, in addition to programming, what else about what you're doing has an impact on what kind of environment you create? All of these findings are actually, there's a report on the website. If you haven't gotten a chance to see it yet, I know that there's a link to it in the chat. I encourage you, there's a lot more detail in there about how we approach the work and some of the findings.
Thank you, Zannie. There is a specific question about other kinds of representation. So there's a participant asking if we looked at other kinds, such as LGBTQ status or age of audience.
We initially, we did not look at LGBTQ or age. And I'll tell you why in just a sec. We did initially look at education. So those with and without college education. We eventually dropped education because, as you can tell, the findings already are kind of a complex story to tell. Having 3 outcomes to get through felt like it was too much. And quite frequently, the findings with respect to education and income tended to hang together. So we thought, this really isn't providing or adding a whole lot to the story to do that. The reasons we focused on racial diversity and income diversity came out of our qualitative research, out of the interviews. The first question we asked about was, what are some of the social issues that are most important to your organization at this moment in time? And the ones that were cited most frequently were with respect to race and to income. Again, this has been going on for a while. It could very well be that organizations shift over time in terms of what they prioritize. But we decided to focus on the 2 outcome measures that were important to this idea of minimalizing polarization. And second, that seemed to be top of mind for the organizations. We could certainly look at, could we replicate the study with different outcomes of LGBTQ or age or other outcome measures, and are interested in continuing to go about this methodology. For ages, it seems like the only way people thought you could understand the characteristics of an audience were to survey them. And there's a lot of bias that goes into survey responses. It's really exciting for us now to think about, for any organization, once we have their box office, their transaction data, we can integrate that with Census Bureau data at the census block level. And so any kind of Census Bureau characteristic that we wanted to study now, we'd be able to study. And not just as a whole, but in different markets or for different kinds of organizations. Really, this is a start of what we hope will be an ongoing and rich relationship with the field in terms of understanding who attends.
Thank you, Zannie. I don't see any other questions. We'll hang on for just a minute as I close if you have any questions that you would like Zannie to answer. You also have her email, and we will be sending out slides and email after the presentation today, if you would like to get in touch with us later. So again, thank you so much, Zannie, for this wonderful presentation of your research. And this really just brings us to the end of our time together.
Thanks
So
everyone
thank you
for
all
coming.
joining.